Welcome back to Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I am pleased to have with me once again Daniel McAdams. Daniel, welcome.
Thanks, Jay. It's great to be back with you again.
It's really good to have you, although the topics that we usually hit on are not very, very happy topics. They're topics of war, unfortunately. It seems we've had a couple of different guests on this show suggest that the war cycle is on the increase, and it certainly does seem to be the case just anecdotally as we look at the news every day. I'd like to talk about maybe the Ukraine first. Can you give us an update on the Ukraine? You know, this morning I was waking up, as I usually do, listening to Bloomberg as I take my shower. I like to catch up with the financial markets and what's going on there. And Bloomberg headline stated that Russia is sending arms to the eastern Ukrainians under the guise of humanitarian assistance. So what is the Ron Paul Institute's version of what is really happening there? Is Putin looking to pick a fight in the Ukraine? Is he sending arms to the eastern Ukrainians? I wouldn't be surprised he is, but the twist, at least, of this headline suggested that he's trying to pretend that he's sending in humanitarian aid when, in fact, he's really arming the eastern Ukrainians to the teeth.
Well, one of the problems with the U.S. government and the Western media is that they are essentially playing stenographer for the government in Kiev, which has told the most insane, outrageous stories, and it's just hard to imagine that they're still publishing this stuff without checking into it. Yeah. I mean, if Bloomberg has evidence that they're doing this, they should. I didn't hear the segment, but they should certainly come forth. Yeah, of course. Is it possible? Yes, but how colossally stupid it would be for Russia to have these big white trucks going through territory that could easily be taken out by the Ukrainian military, depending on which Lugansk or Donetsk they're going, to have it chock full of weapons. Mm. If they're going to deliver it, you'd think that they would do it in a more covert way.
Right.
I mean, who knows? But the question is, how on earth does Bloomberg know this? And please let us in on the secret. It would be very surprising if that were the case. But can't put anything past anyone. But the fact of the matter that the Bloomberg and others don't want to talk about is that the situation for civilians who are not part of the fight in eastern Ukraine is abysmal. It's probably nearly as bad as that for those in Gaza. No water, no electricity, no food. Their apartment buildings are constantly hit with mortar fire from the Ukrainian government troops. You know, it is a humanitarian catastrophe. But because these people aren't favored by the U.S. and the West, it's absolutely ignored. Mm-hmm. It's actually quite, not that I think the U.S. should do anything. What the U.S. should do is to stop doing things, which is butt out, and things would get better. Mm-hmm.
Well, it certainly seems, Daniel, that investigative reporting is an art of the past. It seems to me that what you have are a lot of young, pretty girls and good-looking men on Bloomberg and other major media as well, who simply get their marching orders or get their information from the State Department or from some part of our government, and then they just take that as gospel without ever questioning it, right?
Well, everyone's worried about their career, and if you're, as you say, you're sadly enough, you're young and good-looking for a short period of time.
Yeah.
So you have to do what you can with it, you know. And if you're going to go against the flow, if you're going to challenge people that have a very strong impact on your career, then I guess you'll suffer in the end, you know. But you'd also have to live with your conscience. People like Judith Miller, whose lies fueled the second Iraq War in 2003, will have to live with those lies and live with the destruction that they caused.
Yeah.
So hopefully the few of them will pause and think about what they're doing. Thus far, we've not seen much of that, though.
Well, it seems like everybody's basically out for themselves, and they really don't care very much about what happens in the larger picture. They don't even see the bigger picture. That's what seems to be missing to a great extent. I had a lot of good friends, very intelligent people here in New York City that can't seem to see the danger and the destruction, that the reason they're over here is because we're over there. They just can't grasp that fact, and yet it seems so obvious and so simple a concept. Here's the question. I guess what everybody is thinking about now, as we head into towards the fall and the weather gets cold. Will Russia cut off the oil to Europe and their gas, their energy supplies to Europe when the weather gets cold? Will the Russians be so mean-spirited and so hurtful to retaliate by taking oil and gas away from Europe and let them freeze?
If that's the way the media is presenting it, it's awfully funny because, pardon me. In reality, the opposite is true. Russia is very worried about losing its customers in Europe, where it exports a very good amount of oil.
It wants that revenue.
Yes, it wants the revenue. It's in business to sell the oil. But what's happening, actually, they did cut off Ukraine from gas back in June because Ukraine simply hadn't paid its bills in forever. And also Ukraine wanted the same discounted price that it was receiving when it was a friendly ally of Russia. So you can't, if you're giving me a discount on some product and I start kicking you in the face and demand the same discount, that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
But what is happening, and the vote is taking place today, and I haven't been able yet to see how it might have gone, but the Ukrainian parliament is voting on whether to prohibit the transshipment of Russian gas into Western Europe or into Western and Central Europe, which is a big thing. Mm-hmm. And it's actually had Europe in a panic. Here you have, this goes back to what we said earlier about this Ukrainian government that is somehow unhinged. These people who have taken over, they went straight from the streets of Kiev where they were protesting and beating in cops' heads to going into parliament. So it's no wonder that their behavior hasn't changed much.
Yeah.
I mean, if you even just this past couple of weeks, if you look at some videos, there are violent fistfights in parliament on a regular basis there.
Wow.
So, but here you have these sort of unhinged people saying, "Oh yeah, we're going to fix the Russians. We're going to prevent them from shipping gas to Europe." Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden, Germany, Poland, Austria, and the rest of Europe is saying, "Whoa, hold on a second there."
Right. So let's just make sure that our listeners really understand this, Daniel. What you're saying is the oil and energy is coming from Russia, but it's piped. It's I guess transported through the Ukraine, and the Ukrainians, in order to try to punish Russia, they're voting right now today sometime to whether they're going to prohibit that transportation of energy into Europe through the Ukraine. Is that right?
That is exactly correct.
And so if they do that, it's likely to really, if they do that, and if the people in Europe and the United States understand that it's the Ukrainian government that the United States supports that's doing it, then that ought to make people mad as hell. That ought to make the Europeans and Americans, too, angry if they really knew what the story is. The problem is that isn't the way it's going to be presented here. It's going to be presented as if it's Putin that is keeping the oil and gas from getting into Europe, isn't it? That's the way it will be presented.
It could well be that, but I think cooler heads are starting to prevail in Europe. I've said that before and been wrong, but the Europeans now are facing a serious double whammy because they were bullied along into going along with these sanctions, this latest round of sanctions that the U.S. imposed on Russia. The U.S. bullied them into going along with it, and they were shocked when Russia retaliated. And Russia said, okay, if you're going to sanction us to this degree, this is a whole new level, we are going to enact a 1-year ban on importation of agricultural, cheese, and other similar products from the countries that have imposed sanctions on us. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden, Europe had a panic attack and said, "Oh, that's not fair. That's politically motivated." And
as if our sanctions weren't.
Yeah, but what it means is that a Europe that really is an economic basket case, as your listeners know far better than most, I'm sure, a Europe that is an economic basket case is now facing the loss of one of its serious emerging markets. And this will hit countries like Greece, which is, as you know, is a disaster.
Sure.
The one little bright light they've had is they're selling agricultural products to Russia. It will hit Greece. It's already hit one of the most bellicose countries, and that's Poland, which is taking great glee in sticking its finger in Russia's eye, but now all of a sudden can't sell any of its apples to Russia. And so it's having a panic because it's actually the largest producer of apples in Europe, I believe. So this is a huge part of its economy. So these things, as Dr. Paul always talks about, unintended consequences.
Yeah.
The unintended consequence of Europe blindly following the U.S. in this race toward oblivion is going to be possibly a very serious economic recession in the EU countries.
Well, in the EU countries, and it may also affect the United States much more directly than people seem to think. And Dr. Paul wrote an article, U.S. sanctions on Russia may sink the dollar. Would you care to elaborate a little bit on that article? And by the way, let me just tell our listeners that you really need to go to the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity and read these articles for yourself. Every day, a lot of really very important information is provided there. And Dr. Paul usually has something there. Daniel writes something almost every day, a couple of things, articles you can constantly go and read, and a lot of other very scholarly people are writing and providing information that I think you're not going to get. I know you're not going to get from the mainstream. So Ron Paul wrote an article, U.S. sanctions on Russia may sink the dollar. Would you care to comment a moment on that, Daniel?
Sure, yeah, that came out Sunday and Monday, and actually it was one of our biggest columns ever, so we were thrilled to have it. But I think the point that Dr. Paul makes in the column is that, okay, and he knows this better than I by a long shot, but the short-term markets, the short-term dollar has not seen a lot of effect for what the U.S. has been doing to Russia, the sanctions and this sort of thing. But he's pointing out in the long term, the dollar is going to suffer significantly, and what it's going to suffer is going to take a huge hit as the world's reserve currency because of this, because it's basically forcing countries like Russia to start doing transactions in their own currencies, to set up some sort of a system whereby they can automatically do this. And as more and more countries start bypassing the dollar, and Dr. Paul in the column mentions the BRICS countries that Russia is closer to. And as of right now, I'm sure a lot of your listeners will say, yeah, but BRICS is not willing to stand up to the U.S. and this is not willing to take a plunge completely from the dollar. But we don't know how it will play out. There may be some gradual system that comes forward that slowly takes place. Maybe it won't be one giant leap. Maybe it'll be baby steps that will accelerate the dollar slide. So in a sense, it's a kind of suicide for the U.S. To abuse the dollar as it's doing and use it as a blunt weapon for foreign policy.
Well, certainly this is a topic we talked to David Jensen on, and most often the second hour. He's on vacation the last week or two, so we haven't spoken to him recently. But David is very much in touch with this issue, reading prolifically a lot of articles and information that's taking place. It certainly is true that BRICS are looking to stand up to the United States. They're looking to stand up and set up an alternative international monetary system since they feel they've been frozen out to a great extent, their own IMF-like, their own World Bank type of institution, and they've really been liberalizing the markets so that these transactions can take place. A lot of agreements between Iran and Russia, Iran and China, Russia and China, even Japan and Germany and China directly going around the dollar, not using the dollar in transactions, but using their own currency. So this is definitely, the dollar is losing market share and has been losing market share. But what we're seeing is a real growth in the institutions, including free markets for gold, unlike the gold market in the United States, which is really aimed more at manipulation of the gold price by the major bullion banks who are trading paper gold 100 to 1 over physical gold. So the Asians and the Russians are saying, wait a minute, we think we're not getting a fair deal with the dollar, and they are, for the sake of their own survival, looking, Daniel, I think, at ways to try to skirt around this. So this makes tremendous sense what Dr. Paul wrote, and it's really a theme that we've been talking about on this show on a regular basis. I'd like to switch a little bit to Iraq now, which is another major hot spot that's just picked up. I read in the Financial Times today, it said, again, I just mentioned, the move against Maliki deepens Iraqi crisis as ISIS battle rages. Well, I was a little surprised to see this from the Financial Times, which is such an establishment newspaper, seems to love American intervention in foreign countries. But even the Financial Times is suggesting that whatever we're doing, the strings we're trying to pull against Maliki is causing the Iraqi crisis to get worse, not better. Can you talk a little bit about what's going on in Iraq over the last couple of weeks?
Well, the U.S. has made no secret of the fact that it would like to see Maliki go, and it's been pushing his ouster for some time, and Maliki has resisted. He's not playing the role of the good puppet like you're supposed to do, the U.S. And actually, as of yesterday, he has essentially been ousted. The president has named a new prime minister, and the U.S. has praised it. Maliki claims that this goes against the Iraqi constitution. The U.S. Replied that the president is the guarantor of the constitution. So I guess, therefore, in the old Nixonian thing, if the president does it, it can't be illegal.
Yeah.
So it looks, at least at this point, as if Maliki's out. He still has some militias that are loyal to him. They happen to be rather close to the green zone where the U.S. embassy is located. So, I mean, I'm speculating. It's not impossible that things could get ugly, but I think the U.S. is eager to get him out as soon as possible. And this is the problem that the U.S. interventionism has had from time immemorial. Go back to 1953 or earlier. Is that people that are bought don't stay bought? You know, they start look at Karzai in Afghanistan.
Right.
So basically, look at Saddam Hussein. You know, look at Gaddafi. The people who the U.S. considers as puppets, they start getting uppity, so the U.S. has to take them out. This goes back to the economic hitman that you and I are both so fond of. But this is what's happening, and it's a downward spiral from there. Once they start taking these people out, things just get worse, chaos, and then you'll have a strongman emerge or something of that nature. But so on one hand, the U.S. is making political moves in Baghdad to get rid of Maliki and put someone in who's more to their liking. Meanwhile, in Kurdistan, the U.S. is on a multi-month bombing mission. At least that's the latest from President Obama. He's going to be it's a sort of a 1-2 punch. He's going to be bombing ISIS, the same ISIS that the U.S. helped create and support. Bombing ISIS, and ironically enough, bombing the U.S.'s own weapons, because that's what ISIS is using. They stole them in Iraq, and they were given them or stole them in Syria, because they are, as you know, the rebels who are taking over part of Syria, good friends of John McCain. So the U.S. is blowing up its own weapons. It's using weapons to blow up its own weapons, after which it will need to buy some weapons, and Iraq will need to buy some weapons. So you can imagine Lockheed Martin and other merchants of death are absolutely thrilled with this intervention.
Oh, yeah.
And what the U.S. propaganda did is wrap it all up into what really is a tragic story, but it's only one of 1,000 other tragic stories that a small religious minority group is under particular threat from this ISIS group. Therefore, we've got to go in and stop a humanitarian catastrophe in Iraq. We've got to bomb. We've got to go in and do what we've been doing all along, and somehow it will make things better this time, finally.
Right. Yeah, it would be the first time. I mean, it just seems to me incredible, because if I understand the mix-up, the hatred of these different groups for each other in Iraq, and then we get entangled on one side or the other, and then it just doesn't work. And I mean, if I understand right, Maliki is sort of aligned with ISIS to an extent, or has been?
No, he's not. I mean, he's a Shia, and he's, if anything, he ended up being more aligned with Iran, which had the U.S. pitching fits for a long time.
Yeah.
So it's a three-way. But, you know, Jay, the one thing, though, I think is true is we talk about these are age-old animosities and everything.
Yeah.
And I think that's all true. But I also think that is kind of an easy way out in a way as well, because, and I remember this from the Balkans, where I did a lot of work in the 90s, is that these people lived side by side for generations.
Yes.
Generations, until outsiders. In the Balkans, it was the Germans who were involved in Croatia. The U.S. became involved. And what they did is started driving wedges between these communities that did have differences, but because they were your neighbors, You found a way to work it out,
Mm-hmm.
you know. And I'm convinced. I know that's what happened in the Balkans because I spent so much time there. I'm convinced that's what happens in the Middle East as well. Not just the U.S., but Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the Gulf states. They've all gone in and intervened, and they've turned neighbor against neighbor.
Mm.
And so it's not just the age-old animosities. These things have been watered and fertilized by outside powers.
Mm-hmm. I don't want to open a can of worms here, Daniel, but it seems to me that some of that may also be true in Israel. When we, in 1948, when outside powers created the state of Israel, I don't know if you'd care to comment on that. That's a little bit off topic today, perhaps, but
well, it speaks to the idea of unintended consequences. Obviously, the Jews of Europe suffered tremendously, not just in World War II, but for a long time before that. They had been victims. They had been considered outsiders. Although there was a great deal of integration in society, certainly in Eastern Europe there was. But yeah, they suffered tremendously, and there was a great push to finally find a homeland where they could feel safe. But unfortunately, unintended consequences have not worked out that awfully well, and you have this ongoing conflict. And yes, the U.S. does help to keep the conflict alive by supporting one side or the other. The U.S., as everyone knows, tends to support Israel to a very large degree. And what does it do? It doesn't make Israel safe, because what it does is it provides a moral hazard for them to keep acting recklessly.
right.
If they had to deal with their neighbors, they would most likely find a way to negotiate some sort of a peace settlement, because Israelis certainly don't enjoy living in a state of fear. The Palestinians don't enjoy having their land occupied. Without the U.S., my guess is that they would find some way to work it out.
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly that is the view of Moshe Feiglin of the Knesset, who believes that the United States should butt out. He's a minority in the Likud party, but actually got 18% of the vote when he ran against Netanyahu. So there are some people that believe that way, and he will point to the fact that people did get along, before as well, peacefully. They found ways to get along, as you suggest. But I'd like to, just before we close today, Daniel, get back to one thing that really sort of you mentioned that all of a sudden we find a humanitarian cause that we need to get behind, and so this whole thing of the Kurds and the Christians that are trapped on a mountain, this is the image that we're given, at least in our mainstream media. Why shouldn't Obama then help out to try to protect the Kurds and the Christians that are surrounded by ISIS, and what might happen as a result that would be negative rather than positive?
Well, I think bringing this in is a cynical ploy, and we've heard it over and over again. We heard it in Libya. If we don't intervene now, Gaddafi will slaughter millions. We heard it in Iraq. We heard it in the Iraq War I. Babies are being ripped from incubators. A lot of those stories prove to be untrue, or at least exaggerated to a great degree.
Mm-hmm.
But the real issue is, can the same people who caused the problem intervene in the same manner and expect to solve the problem? If bombs cause this problem, if the U.S. intervention caused the problem, how can more intervention, how can arming the Kurds, which is what the U.S. is currently doing, I mean, it seems like the last thing you'd want to do is pour more gasoline on the fire.
Right.
The U.S. is happily doing it. I'm sure the arms merchants are thrilled about the increase in orders, but they're sending all these weapons over there. The worst part about it, Jay, is the hypocrisy. 500,000 Christians were cleansed from Iraq under U.S. occupation. The U.S. didn't say a word.
Right.
All of a sudden, a few thousand people from an obscure religion are threatened, and the media goes crazy about their plight, following every step of their move. It just goes to show how the media can manipulate things. In Syria, ISIS has destroyed churches, killed Christians, beheaded them, forced conversions for 3 years. Not only did the U.S. do nothing to stop them, it actually helped arm them and support them. So that's why I don't believe a word the government says about this. They've proven themselves to be liars.
Yeah.
What's interesting is that the U.S. feels it has the right to bomb Iraq again for humanitarian reasons. But when Russia, as we were talking about earlier, wanted to actually send in medicine and food to people suffering in eastern Ukraine, here's what the U.S. ambassador to the UN, Samantha Power, said. in protest against Russia giving food and medicine to these people. He said, the humanitarian situation needs addressed, but not by those who have caused it.
Oh.
If that's not true for Iraq, I don't know what is. So the double standards and the hypocrisy is just choking. It's choking.
Right. It really is. And Daniel, that's just something you said a little earlier when we were talking about the Ukraine. These were trucks that went in that were colored white, so they were obviously visible. And is that the way humanitarian aid is sent in very often? And
yeah, because white is the symbol of surrender, the symbol of non-combatants. So painting them to white is to make it very visible that these are non-combatant vehicles.
Right, and I would think that our intelligence, being what it is with all our satellites and so forth, could very easily monitor that situation so that if they were sending in military equipment, that we would know that. Of course, whether we got the truth or not would be another story, but...
Well, the government in Kiev, the lunatics in Kiev, have said that Russia is sending in the S-300 missiles. Good Lord, if the CIA and the NSA can't detect these S-300 missile batteries going in under the guise of these trucks, then what on earth are we paying all these hundreds of billions of dollars for?
Well, amen to that.
And if they've got the goods, then they can do something with them.
Daniel, is there anything else with respect to just this question yet before we conclude our discussion today? Is there anything new on the downed airliner over the Ukraine? Any new information that's come out on either side of this thing?
Well, there have been several articles in the major Malaysian press. They're obviously and understandably getting very frustrated with the fact that there has been no news coming out. They've had the black boxes for weeks, and yet not a word has come out. They said it'll be a while longer for these things to be properly read or something. The investigation has not gone on. The Malaysians have been very concerned. They don't believe the official story. They believe that the Ukrainian government had a hand in it somehow. The U.S. is suddenly completely uninterested.
We're not hearing anything about it now.
The U.S. is totally uninterested. It's moved on.
Right. That's what happens. I mean, I remember in Syria last year the same thing with the supposed gas attacks.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden just silence and the propaganda machine is talking about it not at all. Same as here. So that's why I wondered. So the black boxes where are the black boxes now?
Well, they're in the U.K. British investigators.
Oh well, we can trust the British, of course.
Yeah, I mean it's of concern. And the other thing is the Malaysians have brought this up. They're furious that the Ukrainian government went in and seized the air traffic control records of communications between the Malaysian airlines and the air traffic controllers.
Oh my goodness! Oh my
goodness! The Malaysians would like to see those transcripts.
Sure.
But the Ukrainian government will not release them.
Oh.
They went and seized them immediately after the plane crashed.
Oh, but of course the propaganda here has us being the guy, has the Russians being the ones that are keeping the truth from coming out and not allowing an investigation at the site of the crash and so forth, right?
Except that it's the Kiev government that keeps shelling the area and keeping the OSCE investigators away from it.
Jeez, incredible! I mean, it is incredible. It's like,
and some of the shells have actually damaged some of the area where the plane is down, so it's actually destroying some of the evidence.
Oh, it's just incredible. I mean, it's Pinocchio's nose keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and I just think it's just incredible that Americans can't see this. I guess they can't because they don't want to. They're too busy earning a living. They don't want to investigate. Our reporters aren't doing any investigation. So, somebody said the only people that are really truthful investigators are locked up, as Julian Assange and Mr. Snowden. So,
yeah.
I know that you are, Daniel. You're working hard at it, doing the best you can to bring the truth out, and I really appreciate it very much. All that you're doing. I would just tell my listeners two things. First, go to the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity and read these views and share them with your friends. And number two, if you can possibly manage to do so, make a contribution to the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. Even a small one will be very helpful. And I think that, examine your own heart, your soul, and your mind, and think about what you need to do from a moral perspective, and then do it. That's all I can say. Well, I want to thank you very much, Daniel, for being with us once again today to help us realize what's really going on in our foreign policy.
Thank you so much, Jake, for having me.